Mr. Watson, how we doing?
All right, we've got a cold, foggy morning here in Portland. So fall has arrived. Although I think it's supposed to be actually 70 and sunny this afternoon. So
Ooh,
very nice. Perfect weather.
very good.
Morning.
Hey, Riley. Hey, Morgan.
Hey, Morgan.
Morgan, how's
Hello.
you're on your honeymoon?
I was last week. Yeah, through last Monday.
Nice. You look tanner.
Yeah, actually, it was a fair amount of sun. Just here in BC on the West Coast. But yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Welcome to the club. I'm celebrating 10 years next month with my wife. So
Congrats.
thanks. Once somebody gave me a really sage piece of wisdom right before I got married, and I'm a little too late for you, but the piece of advice that I got was make sure that you not only love your partner every day, but you also like them too. Which is it's sage wisdom, because there's times where I have to remember that I need to both love and like my wife.
That's good advice. Yeah, it was good fun. I did miss 2 weeks of these meetings, I think, but I am finally back.
Where's the air quotes for the miss? You missed these meetings.
I was thinking. I was trying to remember if I was here 2 weeks ago. No, I was not. Okay, so yeah, I did miss 2 weeks. But we will get started in a minute. We'll get started at 9:04 Pacific. All right. Starting at 9:04, which is 1 minute by my clock. All right, let's get started. So, welcome back to the maintainers meeting, everybody. I've been gone for 2 weeks, but I'm back now. So we'll start with our usual SIG check-in, and then we'll move into any topics that people have put down. Starting with the spec SIG. So it looks like 1.7 has not been released yet. We may delay it a little bit more, as we have a pair of issues to decide upon about gzip compression support and adding resource to the sampling API. So if people have opinions on that, please weigh in there. Similarly, for sampling OTEPs, last week's call for final reviews generated some actionable feedback. Josh will update the two OTEPs today and will present a summary of the current state of the proposal in depth at tomorrow's spec SIG. Excellent. Josh, did you want to go through the summary? I'm guessing you wrote this. Do you want to go through the summary right now, or should we wait till we finish the check-in?
Let's finish the check-in. If there's time at the end of this hour, we can talk
Okay.
about Q&A, or I'm going to put a link to Bogdan's suggestion so you can
Okay.
follow the thread.
Perfect. All right, metrics. Experimental version of the SDK spec is done. Will be part of the 1.7 spec release. Ooh, fantastic. We're making progress on the following things: getting the SDK spec to feature freeze. Yep, perfect. Language implementations with the goal to hit beta before the end of November, so we can declare the API and SDK spec as stable. Excellent. Any other color you want to add to that, Josh, or anyone else? Nope. Okay. No update from logs. I was in the logs SIG call last week, and I concur there were no major updates. PHP, there's still 17 large issues that are open that need to be moved towards a beta release. 38 issues remaining to move towards GA release. Some new contributors are trickling in. Woohoo! Still need more. Boo. Intuit acquisition.
Yeah, MailChimp last week announced that they were getting acquired by
I
Intuit.
saw that.
Yeah, so there are still a lot of things in flux with that I don't know. I'm definitely going to continue to try and be the PHP maintainer even after that acquisition, but I don't know if Intuit has the same policies yet on allowing 20% time or 50% time or whatever it is. So I will keep you all updated. I don't expect
Okay.
that to change, but just thought I'd mention it.
Okay, perfect. Java metrics SDK work continues apace. Okay. Java instrumentation 1.6 was released. Working hard to stabilize the instrumentation API. Cool. JavaScript started the 1.0 process last week. Hit some minor snags, but nothing that can't be resolved quickly. Ooh, that's a big jump. Do we have Daniel on to talk about it?
Yeah, I am. It's not that big of a jump. I mean, we've been talking about the 1.0 for a while now.
Yeah.
But we've had some CNCF policy issues, I guess, more than anything. And in the end, we just decided to change our tooling they were not going to change, so we did.
Okay, fair enough.
So last week we started the process for our 1.0. We opened the PR, and in deciding which packages would go to 1.0 and which would be held back as experimental, we discovered some dependencies where a package that we wanted to be stable depended on packages that we wanted to still be experimental. So we're working on splitting those.
Okay. Cool. And I saw Python, we had a 1.5 release 2 weeks ago while I was out. That's great. No major updates since then. .NET metrics are releasing Alpha 4 today. Higher performance and other tweaks. Starting on views to be part of the next release. Go planning a stable 1.0.0 release today. Wow, that's great.
Yeah, we're pretty excited.
Yeah, I bet. That's fantastic.
Let us know where to send the champagne, Tyler.
Yeah, I know. We'll have to coordinate on that one.
C++ v1.0.0 for Trace was also released. What a week. After formal closure of the TC review, start planning for the metrics API implementation. Man, we are rolling. That's great. All right, any updates for Ruby, Swift, or the collector? All right, we'll keep going. First topic is from Tigran. Should OTLP or gRPC or OTLP HTTP be the default? And I don't know if I actually saw Tigran on the call. So I will open this issue. All right, there's not a whole lot here. Any opinions over which should be preferred or which should be the default? Like I personally understand the differences. I didn't realize we were still discussing what should be default, but any thoughts that people have?
Yeah, I thought it had already been chosen too, but since it hasn't, I'd like to say I think it should maybe be default gRPC, but with the caveat that if your language or whatever doesn't have a decent or a stable enough gRPC client, that it can use HTTP as the default.
Any other thoughts, Yay, nay. I had actually personally thought that gRPC was the default already, so I'm surprised that this came up. I don't know, any like
What Tristan said was the thing.
Do we need to specify a default? Can't either be appropriate?
where you have to pass a param.
I think Tristan's right. You usually make that choice at the build time. You choose what you want, and then either will be acceptable at runtime to me.
And Tyler, I think I heard you speaking, but you were extremely quiet. Tyler?
There, maybe that's a little better.
That's better.
Sorry
Yep.
about that. Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think we had this conversation before, and what Tristan said, what I thought was the conclusion on that was, I think it was JavaScript, or maybe it was another language, but they did not have a good gRPC implementation, and it made more sense to have maybe it was an encoding option, but I thought it was the transport protocol, the HTTP.
I think Ruby had some issues with their gRPC implementation, if I recall.
With regards
That
to
might be
web,
it, yeah.
basically we don't have gRPC for web. So only for Node, yeah. So this cannot be even default.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is either make it the sort of better implemented one, which, and if all things are equal, make it gRPC, or the alternative, which I think Josh you're proposing, was just like make it a param that has to be passed, right? Like a non-optional parameter.
I don't think anyone wants to link in both implementations into their binary. That's the reason
Yeah.
why I don't think it ever comes a choice where you choose the
Yeah.
better of two options.
So that's definitely not true for Java. We include both options in our auto configuration, and people choose that at runtime.
Okay.
Java works differently, right? We're not generating binaries. We bundle everything up in dependency management. So
Yeah, in JS, we're actually working right now on splitting the exporters so that we'll have a separate exporter for each protocol, but then also a separate for each signal. So
Okay. So we'll leave this feedback here for Tigran. Josh, correct me if you disagree, but I guess what I'm hearing is maybe it does make sense to just have it default to one, because there will be cases where, for whatever reason, people do include both implementations. Okay, great. I'll add that to notes. Next,
it
go
looked
ahead.
like Tigran's note said that he thought that the HTTP implementation was more efficient. But I don't personally have any details about what he meant by that. So.
Yeah, and it may also be CPU efficient. I mean, I assume this might even differ per language. Granted, this is coming from Tigran, so I would presume he's talking about the collector or the Go implementation. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll leave this feedback for Tigran, but I think what I'm hearing is generally make it, if all things are equal, make it gRPC, if that's because everybody thought that that's how it already was. All right, and I will update those notes in a minute, but the next discussion, also from Tigran, standardize the name of the logging/standard out exporter. So different SDK and collectors use different names for the exporter that writes the standard out. For Go, it's standard out. For Java, it's logging. For .NET, it's console. Collector is logging. And for others, it doesn't yet exist. We should probably pick a standard name for this.
There's a subtlety in here, though, that I think
Yes.
called out by a commenter, that in Java, logging means it uses a logger, which can be standard out. It can go anywhere you can send your logging to. So it's not necessarily the same as standard out. I think Yuri
That's a
called
good
that.
point. Yeah. Yep, I'm just scrolling down to see the latest comments here.
Oh yeah, and the other comment was, of course, in Java we have two logging exporters, one that is OTLP and one that is just a lightweight kind of debug enabled
Yes. Yeah, and further confusion as logging becomes a more sort of first-class signal type in OpenTelemetry. There's a difference between writing your traces and metrics to logs as sort of a sanity check thing versus writing logs.
Yeah, I think we're going to have both a logging OTLP exporter and an OTLP logging exporter, depending on which of those things you're talking about.
So straightforward.
No confusion there at all.
Trying to align the name might be hard. For example, in C++, people are very familiar with the like the cout, the std cout, which like in C++, you hardly see anything like console. Everyone call that standard out, standard error or something. In .NET, it's just there's a system.console class. So I'm guessing it might be already well established with each language. So trying to align here doesn't seem to be something that we can do.
Okay, I'm just catching up with the notes. May be usage of logging may confuse people with actual hotel derived log signals. Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is from Riley, you're basically saying you don't think we can standardize it, and from John, you're saying that also it probably may make sense to use different names in different contexts. Yeah. Okay. All right. And the next topic that I didn't know we had, I think we've got two. So I have one just we're introducing a new person. And then Josh had his the thing we wanted to talk about. So my one topic is I think we've Ounce on the call. Ounce just joined our team at Splunk as a PM on how we get data in, but he's going to be spending a big chunk of his time on OpenTelemetry. So you may see him on this call or other calls. So Ounce works for me, and we don't have a huge number of product managers in OpenTelemetry, but I figured it'd be nice to have someone who can also work with various SIGs and help keep them organized, and generally help contribute in ways that I have in the past. So we can have some more people basically assisting in non without just committing code and doing pure engineering things. So Andrew, if you're on this call, you may want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so it's great being here. I think I'm very excited to be able to just be able to really contribute in any way possible. I think in this project as well. And I did join Splunk a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be here. I think just looking through and being able to join today and see all the updates, I think that's been great as well. So yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm hoping to be able to help us really move towards our goals and milestones. I think that will be exciting to look at it. Thanks.
All right, and next up is Josh. You want to take it away?
Hi, if I just thought we could have a moment for open Q&A about sampling or sampling OTEPs that I've been working on. Although it occurs to me that I should probably disclaim that there's a discussion going on about resources in the sampling API, and that is not one I've been working on. I have commented on it. If that's the question, it's more of an open Q&A for everyone. If you want to talk about probability sampling, I have been working on these OTEPs for the past month, and they're very close to being mergeable. We are going to be proposing that we include probability information so that the parent sampler can include its probability, as well as the consistent sampling spec to do trace ID ratio sampling. All that is pending and ready for merging. And the last question that came up was about how we encode this information in the span. I'm going to be updating all of my OTEPs today, and then I'm going to present a pitch. I'm going to explain it in one walkthrough tomorrow. I expect it'll take about 10 minutes at the spec SIG meeting tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Any questions about probability sampling? If not, I propose that I speak for another 30 seconds on the topic of resources and sampling. So there's this issue number, I can't remember which, open about whether we should add the resource to the sampler API. It's blocking the 1.7 spec release, which is why it's been hotly debated recently. The two positions are samplers should be the one-stop shop for configuring a tracer. So therefore, they need to be able to do anything, including sample based on the resource. The opposite position is that resource should be a immutable record once the SDK is up and running. Therefore, it's constant. Therefore, it doesn't belong in your sampling decision. And it occurs to me as I've been thinking about this in the past few days that the discussion is really not about sampling. It's really about where you want your configuration to go. The way things are heading, if we follow this proposal, configuration ends up in the sampler. Anything you do to configure how you view your spans will be part of a sampler. And I'm starting to feel like that's not a logical outcome, the best outcome that we could have. To me, it would be better if we referred to sampling as a sort of mathematical exercise for estimating how many spans there are, essentially. And this other topic, which is how do I suppress my spans? How do I select them based on, configure my tracer based on resource? Those are decisions that are going to use the resource, but they are part of configuring an SDK. When and at the moment, the OTel specs just don't say very much about configuring an SDK. And so this proposal to put resource into the sampler is effectively pushing us away from configuring SDKs and pushing us towards configuring samplers. And I don't think we should go that way, but it's I'm not the only person with an opinion on this. Would anyone like to comment or respond to that statement?
Josh, could you talk a little bit about how that's different from the instrumentation library name?
That's also related here, and it's been discussed. And I've put this into the thread. The question is, okay, we have two concepts here. One is resource, one is instrumentation library. And the instrumentation library is provided statically to a tracer. And then at some point, when you call your sampler API, we've already merged in the spec for the 1.7 release that the instrumentation library will be part of the sampling input. And you could argue that that's not the way I expected this to go. We have talked about these named tracer, the named tracer idea was so that we could have each library get its own configuration or its own behavior or its own suppression or whatever it was. So we already put this library string at a point where it's statically constructed. And then the question is, why would you go and use that in your sampler? Wouldn't you instead prefer to customize the sampler for each instrumentation library? Because that's where we're heading. We don't really want to be making a dynamic decision based on runtime, or sorry, based on resource and based on the instrumentation library, because those could have been made statically. So the sort of resistance to this PR, this proposal that's blocking 1.7, is that you don't need to change the spec to update your sampler to use the resource. You just don't need to do that. We also don't need instrumentation library in there. But the reason why the spec is still there is that people want to forget about tracers and just look at a record, which is resource, instrumentation library, plus all the other dynamic attributes. And my opinion is it's pushing us towards a very inefficient sampler implementation where you actually make a decision based on resource at runtime for every span, and you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of, I mean, the inefficiency I know has been raised, and we've kind of seen it. I've seen it actually in load testing of the Java instrumentation, where I want 1% sampling to be like way less overhead, but we do so much work. Well, I guess that doesn't help. That doesn't help because you still have to capture the attributes. So this is for instrumentation library name. So if from the direction that you're proposing, would we then pull out instrumentation library name from the sampler before 1.7?
I mean, I don't have the energy to fight for that myself, but yes, I think that would make sense. And what we could do in its place, maybe, would be to specify something about how you construct an SDK. And we have vague statements about how the resource must be attached to an SDK, which must then therefore be applied to all the spans, right? But we don't have anything about saying how the sampler gets attached to the SDK. And if there's always a one-to-one mapping between sampler and SDK, then you could create a new sampler API, which is something like a sampler is just a factory for sampler instances. And the sampler, first you say, I've got an instrumentation library, or sorry, first you say, I've got a resource, give me your sampler builder. And then you say, I've got an instrumentation library, give me my sampler for this instrumentation library and resource. And then there's a factory essentially constructing those samplers at, sometime during your application startup. And then when you get to a span from some library that you're trying to suppress, you've got a no-op tracer right there because you configured that tracer for a no-op. And then when you get to the other library that you want 1% sampling on, you know that it got 1% sampling because of, like a decision that was made based on the resource or the instrumentation library at startup. And so that you should only be using dynamic attributes that are things that are actually variable at the time you're doing the sampling decision. And Trask, you're right, that doesn't necessarily save you the entire expense of constructing a span because you had to produce those attributes in the first place. My proposal as sort of to sidestep this lengthy debate and to allow both approaches was to have an option for the SDK to implement a fancy sampler API, which would be an efficient form. So basically the spec would then say the SDK must provide a sampler API that acts as if, and then you can modify the sampler API to do the same behavior, but to pre-calculate something based on resource or instrumentation library.
Right. So what do people think about, because I feel like the instrumentation library name and resource should either both go into the sampler or neither. Like I would hate to release 1.7 with just the instrumentation library name, because that's a breaking change, right? We have to add a new overload, and then if we do add resources later, that's another overload. I would prefer to hold on both of those till we decide the path forward.
We put instrumentation library in 1.6, but has any language actually implemented that at this point?
I thought, yeah, I didn't realize that, John. I thought this was the reason why we were stuck on the resource question was that this was going to be a breaking change when we released 1.7.
That's
So
what I thought too.
could be wrong, but I thought that had been merged before 1.6 was released.
I don't know.
This was part of its release, so it's still not released.
Okay.
Instrumentation library hasn't been? I thought that had been.
No, we hold it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think neither should be in there. I completely agree with Josh. I've been working right now on this tracer provider configuration. I don't know if, Josh, you were talking about SDK, but to me this sounds like a tracer provider configuration type thing, which I guess could be involved through.
That's what I mean. I think of SDK as I think of combining multiple providers. So you're going to have a meter provider and a tracer provider and a logger provider or something like that, and that's the SDK that you configure.
Right. Yeah. So this came up because users of the Erlang and Elixir library were wanting to configure their sampler based on what application is creating the span. And so right now working on multiple provider setup that can be chosen depending on what application is in use. And that makes, if we start adding instrumentation library and resource into the sampler, people are going to start using that instead of going the direction of creating the proper trace provider and generate a tracer from that.
Yeah, that's right.
So as the author of that pull request, which added instrumentation library to the sampler interface, now hearing what Josh said, I have to agree with him that pre-configuring samplers for tracers seems like a better idea, certainly more performant idea. So I'm not SDK developer, so I'm not sure how easy or hard that would be to implement, but on the idea level, I have to agree that, yeah, that's probably the better idea, and we should pull off that instrumentation library pull request out of the spec release.
Just to add some general color to your statement, I think the I hinted at something which is called configuration, and Tristan just described it almost exactly, which is that like you're going to set up some tracers and you have different configurations for different instrumentation library, and different behavior based on resource, which is something at startup. In the metrics SDK, which I wouldn't blame any of you for not following closely, we have created this proposal that's in the feature freeze called a view specification. And views are all about choosing the behavior on a per instrumentation library basis and a per instrument basis. And I mean, resources included in the statement there as well. But the idea being that you're going to have a big amount of configuration handed to you at startup, and you're going to configure all your meters and how each instrument behaves. And that might include multiple aggregations for some instruments and so on. And I feel like that's the direction that we want to go for tracing, which is to say that given a bunch of static configuration, you're going to configure an SDK using your resource, and then you're going to configure a bunch of tracers using information for each instrumentation library, and then you're going to have a behavior that's based on span name, and then you're going to have some sampling logic, and there's like that's going to be configured, and then we'll be talking about probability sampling at the leaves of that configuration, and we'll be counting spans. It'll be great. Based on the silence, I think what I'm hearing from two people now is we should propose to revert the PR that added instrumentation library to the sampling API. And then my recommendation is that we, as a group, talk about configuring views for spans and having that include the configuration based on resource and or instrumentation library and or span name plus attributes and so on.
I think it's a good idea, even if we come back to, for some reason that didn't work out and we decide to come back, then at least we can do both instrumentation library name and resources together in either direction, not split them up.
Right, and I think it's as a thought experiment, just imagine that you had a sampler that did not include the instrumentation library. You could, I think anyone here could do a fairly simple exercise to construct a sampler that produced one additional input from the instrumentation library and called a new API that didn't need to be spec'd or exported. So you can implement a sampler based on the instrumentation library if you care to. But the reason why is that you're gonna do something adaptive. Like I'm gonna do a fixed rate limit over all my spans, and I'm gonna say I want a balanced instrumentation library or something like that, so that you're gonna end up with an average number equal for every instrumentation library. That's the kind of sampling that would use instrumentation library, and that's fancy. And I don't think we should have that built into the spec.
So Carlos, why do you mention that hold 1.7 until October? I mean, it sounds like if we just pull out this one PR, then you know, we're just delaying that one piece to 1.8.
That's a possibility. So I mean, if there's agreement that we can remove this PR, then it's totally fine. But if we need to discuss more details, then I would rather wait.
My impression was that Christian's main concern objection was he didn't want to release the add instrumentation library name without resource, since basically if then resource would never get added, because that would be another breaking change. So I would imagine pulling that out and, you know, making the decision in 1.8 seems good. But
that would work.
We can see what people say on the revert PR.
Makes sense.
Will someone here nominate themselves to submit that revert PR?
I will do it.
I was going to nominate Nikita since he sent the original PR.
Oh, he can do that as well.
Okay, I will do that.
Thanks.
All right. Well, if we're all done with that topic, are there any other topics for today? Then I think we're done. I'll see you guys on the calls later this week and the maintainers call next Monday. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ara. Bye.
Bye.